I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
And I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And this is the Michael Mann movie tournament. We have taken the top 8 Michael Mann movies according to critic scores and audience scores on Rotten Tomatoes. We are on a quest to find the best Michael Mann movie, or maybe the most Michael Mann movie, a slightly different concept. The way that we've set this up is we have a series of knockout rounds in which randomly drawn, we've paired, 2 of these 8 movies, one against the other. In our last round, we had Thief versus The Insider, and Thief advanced to our grand finale. We got to pick another winner here in our second matchup, which is between Ferrari, number 7 seed, a 73% critic score, 73% audience score, exactly the same on Rotten Tomatoes, versus number 2, Manhunter, with a 90% critic score and a 77% audience score. That is interesting. That is, I think, the largest divergence between critics and audience for a Michael Mann movie. We're going to try and talk about these movies, individually, and do the perhaps slightly reductive thing of picking a winner, picking the best out of each elimination, knockout round. But also we want to think more broadly about what makes a Michael Mann movie, or maybe what are some of the themes and ideas that seem to unify his body of work. You want to start with Ferrari,
Sure.
Jeff? Okay.
Sure. Okay, so Ferrari is I think it's the most recent on my list, 2023. It is a kind of a biopic about Enzo Ferrari, the famed car engineer and maker in post-World War II Italy predominantly. The movie looks great, I think. It stars Adam Driver as Enzo Ferrari and Penelope Cruz as his kind of estranged spouse.
I sense this is a lukewarm way into discussing the movie Ferrari, Jeff.
I think the acting performances are strong. I think Adam Driver is aged in a way that may or may not be persuasive, I think, depending
He's
upon...
20 years too young to play that character.
But he is,
don't you think?
Maybe. I don't know.
I think
I wasn't bothered by the aging of
some of the alternate castings earlier. Man had been trying to make this movie for many, many years and never quite got it off the ground. At various points, like people like De Niro was slated to play Enzo Ferrari.
Yeah. I mean, I think Driver's very good.
Okay.
And I think he's a very good actor. And I was okay. That didn't throw me out of things, so to speak. I think Penelope Cruz is excellent as the sort of estranged spouse. But the movie is somehow, it's fine while it's on. Right? I like to think of there's, certain music that while you're listening to it, it's fine. You wouldn't turn it off. It's interesting enough to keep watching. But then when it's over, you don't feel much compunction to go back and revisit it.
Taylor Swift.
To think about it. I was actually thinking of the rock band Wilco.
Okay.
Which is, for me, is fine while it's on. But
let's alienate more people.
Yeah.
U2.
I like U2 by and large. At least, sort of peak U2.
Coldplay.
Yeah. Okay. I don't think we'll get much pushback on that one. But I think, and there are definite Michael Mann moments, right? There's the slow-mo elements, particularly around homicidal violence or just sort of mortal violence, right?
It's a movie suffused in death.
We get it here. It's, all of the deaths that are linked to the car racing elements are they're all portrayed in these very slow-mo kinds of ways, very graphic, surprisingly graphic. I thought the sort of the big accident.
But death is a big theme, right? There's a lot of talk about the war, about both wars actually, about his son who dies from a genetic condition, and then constantly, which is the condition of the racing driver, right? That death is just
here's the strangest thing. Here's the strangest thing about Ferrari. For a movie that is so clearly time-bound and bound in a very particular place, you get very little actual understanding of who these characters are, of what motivates them, of how it might matter that this is post-war Italy. And it's a strangest lack of contextualization for a movie that would appear to require that kind of depth of storytelling. And so, for example, I don't think we really have any idea who Enzo Ferrari is. We're supposed to understand him as some kind of mechanical genius, but we don't get any sense of motivation. I don't really understand how the marriage falls apart. The child dies, but it certainly sounds as though that's not the instigating event for the collapse of the marriage. Why they stay together is sort of explained, but it's
a business. They've got a business.
It's a kind of
problem,
a business relationship, but it's something more than that, and then it's not that. I don't really understand. I think we're not supposed to see Penelope Cruz's character, I think, in a particularly sympathetic light, but I don't understand why she's supposed to be so terrible. I just find these characters to be, they should be embedded in their context in ways that are rich and evocative, and they just aren't. And I found that to be unsatisfying.
Okay, so that's interesting. So I'm going to try, I'm just naturally drawn to try and make a bit of a counter argument, which is, I think we're establishing something about Michael Mann characters, which is they operate better in the register of like archetype than plausibly fully formed person. So I think what Ferrari's, he's obviously a patriarch, right? And a lot of this movie is about, him as a patriarchal figure in business, but also in his life. And then there's a great sort of dualism that's going on, I think, in this movie. I think if I was to try and tie it together thematically, so you've got a dualism in Ferrari's sort of motivations or how he exists in the world, in that he wants to be, again, a great Michael Mann theme, the artisan, the craftsman, but he's having to confront the era of mass production and the commercial necessities of mass production. So there's those dual sides of his character, and he's aware that they're at war. But there's also this thing about sons, fathers and sons, and a patriarch in that context. So he's got two sons, right, representing, again, two sides of his character. He's got one son who he clearly loved very deeply and has died from a genetic condition, and is his acknowledged kind of heir, if you're thinking about patriarchs, but can't be his heir because he's died. Yeah. And then he's got an illegitimate son who, I think he loves as well, but he's not allowed to kind of acknowledge as his legitimate heir. And so you've got one son who's his actual heir, who died and was sickly, and weak sounds pejorative, but you know what I'm saying. Yeah. Then he's got a strong and vibrant son whom he is not allowed to acknowledge as his legitimate heir. And it's almost monarchical once you think about it in those ways. And then later, when you have the horrifying accident, if you notice, they do a similar thing, which is the family that bears the brunt of that horrifying accident, the pedestrians into whom the race car crashes, they also have two sons. Yep. And one son runs out, both sons run out to watch the race, and the father goes and retrieves one son and brings him away, and the other son is then left to kind of die. So there's those things going on, which, they function as kind of literal depictions of these characters, but I think are supposed to be, I'm not quite sure what it is, but they're supposed to be making some broader archetypal point about patriarchy, fathers, death, legacy. Those kind of themes seem to be what's going on in this movie.
Yeah, I agree. I think I agree.
Okay.
That's fine. I think that's persuasive as an evocation of what the movie hopes to do. To me, you could tell that story in any context whatsoever.
Sure.
Why does it matter that we're telling this in post-war Italy with these characters in particular? That I can't get a sense of.
Yeah, I understand. I mean,
I also find it strange, and then I'll stop talking, but I find it strange that you're dealing with a very rich mechanical kind of car culture that is almost completely left unexplored. Right, we have, Maserati plays a very tiny little role. Fiat plays an even tinier little role in this movie. But like, this is kind of, in the Italian sports car industry, this is the golden age. And somehow none of that appears to inform anything that's going on the screen in ways that I find missed opportunities, strangely dissatisfying as a storytelling set of opportunities. And so, as I say, I think the movie was fine while it was on. I can't imagine I would watch it again. And even the car race scenes, as you had alluded to off camera, are somehow strangely not very thrilling.
Yes. Yeah. So I think there's two things I say. One in terms of its setting in post-war Italy, as you're right, almost totally ignored, except for stylistically, and it does look like the cars look amazing, and the suits and everything. Like, you really do feel like there's been a lot of thought going into recreating that period. But as you say, not really explored. What left unexplored is what it would mean to tell this story in that context. The one thing I will say, though, is that the best and funniest line in the movie is, I think it's the mother says about the wife, I'd rearm Germany before I gave that woman a gun. Which I thought was a fantastic line. And they allude to her as, her gentleness, the senorita, which is obviously said in irony. No, that's funny, and that's funny to us. It is worth pointing out that many man movies do have a problem with their female characters. Yeah. And although she's portrayed as this kind of awful wife, and we've just laughed at that fact, if you were to retell the movie from her point of view, her behavior is perfectly rational and reasonable. Yeah. She actually acts in a responsible, business-like and family-like fashion.
And I think it's a credit to Penelope Cruz's performance that, in spite of the characterization, I think you still feel some empathy for her.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I agree. And then last thing maybe we'll say on this, I diagnose the central problem of this movie as, look, it's Ferrari, and they clearly wanted to set up a grand finale, what's it called? The Milli Miglia?
Yeah.
And so you think this is what's going to structure the movie and give it dramatic motion is the kind of races, the climactic races. Did you see the Brad Pitt F1 thing that came out recently? So that that's kind of how you do that kind of thing. It's maybe a less ambitious movie thematically than Ferrari, but that's sort of how you would use the races as a dramatic storytelling effect. But the problem we've got is that Enzo Ferrari is not driving the damn car. Yeah. And the movie is all about him, his motivations, and the rest of it. But the people who are doing the racing, you spend almost no time with the drivers. Right. I couldn't tell one apart from the other. Yep. And that gives it... So Ferrari ends up an inert character, and the motion in the movie is actually given to you by people who you actually don't know anything about or really care about. And it's just a sort of mismatch of who's doing what in the drama, I think.
I agree.
Okay, all right, good. So that was number 7, Ferrari. Let's talk about seed number 2, Manhunter. Manhunter, what a movie.
I don't think we don't need to, do false suspense here. Like, Manhunter's vastly better movie.
Manhunter's going through.
Manhunter is going through. I had not watched Manhunter in a long time. I didn't see it when it first came out. So but it's been maybe 10 or 15 years. And there were a couple of points at which I think in retrospect I got confused. I confused Manhunter with the later Red Dragon, which is it's not really a remake. It takes the same source material, Thomas Harris's novel, as its foundation point. And so I think I there were a couple moments in the mists of my memory where I confused the two characterizations.
Manhunter is the superior telling of that story.
A significantly better, I think, version of the story. This, to me, is where the stylistic stuff really matches with the substance of Man. This is where he's hitting on all cylinders here, because it still has the kind of the close-up stuff. It's, close-up on anodyne objects, right? This, for example, this is how the movie begins, right? There's sort of through the eyes of the serial killer, the Tooth Fairy, we see him walking up the stairs of the victim's home, and we see the camera sort of flashes at like a stuffed penguin, and it flashes at something else sitting on some other anodyne, like a piece of clothing or something that someone has left out on the stairs. And this is a scene that is repeated later on when the investigator, Will Graham, is investigating the same scene. And so we've got this clear doubling, right, of the characters, which is also, a kind of a commonplace element in a certain way of Michael Mann's movies. Then we do have a little bit of slow-mos, right? But here, the slow motion elements, I think, are very sparsely used. Right, the only one I can remember is the actual death of Dollaride, of the Tooth Fairy killer. Whereas, you go back to a movie like Thief, and the slow-mo is just constantly, it's everywhere. Every time that there's something that is some kind of propulsive or meaningful physical event, it's slowed down and portrayed in this way that, to me, just would sort of throw me out of the action. None of that happens here. There's a really good use of moodiness here. The synth music is I think more appropriately used. It's frequently used in dark backgrounds or at nighttime. The contrast here between daytime and nighttime, I think, is really effective and successful. The contrast between what it's like to step into, like when Will Graham is interviewing Hannibal Lector, right? The use of space, right, in those scenes is really, really well done. And the storytelling is really good, right? There's no point at which this movie falls into the cliches of the horror movie genre. And I think it's really successful in that way. And so I think this is a really good movie. I think for the serial killer genre and the catching of the serial killer, it's really, really good. My one complaint, I do think the third act drags a little bit.
Okay.
So I think the movie's 10 minutes too long.
What are you regarding as the third act?
The third act is really all the stuff about the Tooth Fairy, right? When the action switches to the Dollaride character, I think it becomes too slow for my tastes, and it drags just a little bit, but nowhere near the kind of slowdown in pace that we see in some of his other movies. So, I mean, I really am very positive on this movie, and I think it does a really good job of being sinister, but also very watchable.
Well, I think the fundamental reason why it works is that the movie thematically is about the same thing that movies are about, at least to Michael Mann, which is seeing. Mm-hmm. Right, that's the whole thing, right? Mm-hmm. It suffuses everything. So Will Graham obviously has this, his great capacity is to see himself or sink himself into the minds of the people who are committing the terrible acts, which causes him terrible pain. Mm-hmm. And then Dollarhide believes that by being seen performing kind of godlike acts, he's
being accepted.
He's being accepted. And Graham has that famous scene where he says, everything with you, where he's figuring out Dollarhide, everything with you is seeing, isn't it? Your primary sensory intake that makes your dream live is seeing reflections, mirrors, images. Yeah. Well, what is filmmaking except making a dream live through kind of the things that are in your head and putting it on the screen and so forth? And then some of the things that you've talked about as kind of Michael Mann tricks or tropes, sorry. The slow motion, some of the even kind of glitchiness in the film that happens, I think, in the climactic scene in Thief, and then definitely again and again in the climactic Graham Dollarhide, scene. That they're meant to. I don't think they're just stylistic tricks. They're meant to convey a hyper-realism, or even in Manhunter, a supernaturalism. Right, Dollarhide is working himself into what he believes to be a supernatural state. Mm-hmm. Will Graham, you can explain his empathy as just he's very empathetic. Mm-hmm. There are also strong hints of the supernatural about the way that Graham kind of inhabits the minds of the serial killer. And maybe at some point you become so extremely empathetic that it's indistinguishable from what we might have classically regarded as clairvoyance or something along those lines. And then at the end, when the two clash, those two worlds collide, and Graham, who spends the whole movie looking out into the night through glass, through windows, and staring out into the evil of them, and that's how he's trying to think himself into Dollarhide's mind. And then at the end, he crashes through the glass to literally stop Dollarhide, and that's very significant. And then in those moments of confrontation, they're in slow motion, and the camera also glitches kind of out of sync and stuff. I think you're being told, or at least it's been alluded to, that this is a hyper-real experience. This is something that, from Graham and Dollarhide's perspectives, or if you were inclined to go that far, maybe I actually were being told this is a quasi-supernatural conjunction of forces that's happening.
Yeah.
And certainly when you stage that in a movie, you're going to have to show it schematically in a hyper-real sense. So what I'm trying to say, and maybe be shorter, is all of Michael Mann's kind of tricks here are in service of the fundamental theme of the movie, which is it's about seeing, and it's about something that's on the cusp between the natural and the supernatural.
Yeah, I mean, those are really sharp points, and they illustrate, it's kind of my incoherent sense, or they put meaning to my sort of incoherent sense, that this is the movie where it kind of all comes together for Mann, that he's got the proper story to tell, and that these techniques, which he uses frequently, it seems to me, whether they are in the service of telling the story or not, here they hit, right? And so it reminds me of, for example, when on occasion you will get these really talented filmmakers, and they've got the right script, and all of their all of their tropes as sort of storytellers come together. And I'm thinking of Inglourious Bastards as Tarantino's, I think is very easily his best movie, because all of that stuff comes together. And he's got the right script, he's got the right actors, he's got the right story to tell. And this is how Manhunter feels to me for Michael Mann, that like he's got all of the ingredients in place, and it's just a perfect stew for what he's really wanting to do and what come to be his sort of distinctive stylistic elements.
Yeah.
I think the movie holds up really well. I was surprised at how well it held up, because I sometimes confuse this movie with the movie To Live and Die in L.A.
Okay.
Have you seen that?
Yes.
Which Michael Mann is not a Michael Mann movie, but it is William Peterson, and the aesthetic is very similar. It is another one of those kinds of very neon type of approaches. I think Michael Mann might have a credit in there somewhere, maybe like, one of the many executive producers. But, the movies came out at the same time, and they star William Peterson as their protagonist. But Manhunter is a vastly better movie. And I think it's William Peterson's best performance. And what a strange kind of career arc William Peterson has had, right?
CSI.
He then becomes the main character on CSI for a long time, but he's not a movie star. And to me, it's very strange. I would have thought, and I don't know anything about William Peterson, but you would have thought, based upon the strength of his performance in Manhunter, that he would have been one of the big movie stars of the 1980s.
Yeah.
And that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's another way in which Manhunter maybe feels like it's a moment where all the different ingredients came together.
Yeah. I think Brian Cox's choice to play Lecter understated.
Yes.
Because maybe everyone in my generation comes to Lecter through Sir Anthony Hopkins and who played Lecter as large as you can possibly, and it's I am Sir Anthony Hopkins. Look at me doing acting. Whereas Brian Cox is just incredibly sort of, understated, and it's really, really sort of terrifying.
Yes.
And a scene that could be ridiculous actually really works, which is Will Graham running away from Lecter. Yeah. You can see how terrified he is of Lecter. Yep. And he knows he just has to get away from him. He's sustaining massive one word.
But he's getting away from himself as well. And that's the reason why that scene is so effective.
Right. But if you notice, he runs back and forth, like he's in a maze he can't get out of, back and forth, going nowhere, running as fast as he can.
Because Lecter has told him what he knows, right? Which is that actually the two of them are very, very similar.
Yeah, you want to get the scent, smell yourself. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's very good. So I want to put down a marker for something we might think about, especially with later movies, and I'm thinking about Heat a lot, of a possible Michael Mann theme. Okay, so what goes on in Manhunter? There's a crucial exchange between Lecter and Will Graham where Lecter says to Graham, "You caught me, you must think you're smarter than me."
Yeah.
And Graham says, "I know I'm not smarter than you." Mm-hmm. And Lecter says, "Well, why did you catch me then?" And Graham says, "You had disadvantages." Lecter says, "What are they?" And he says, "You're insane." Mm-hmm. Okay. And then there's another scene where Graham is explaining to his son what's happening and why they're being hunted by Dollarhide. And his son says, "So Dad, that man wants to kill us. When are you going to kill him?" Mm-hmm. And Graham says, "It's not my role to kill him. It's my role to catch him."
Yeah.
Okay. And what happens that allows Graham to catch Dollarhide is not only his empathy, but there's a lot of craftsmanship, another Michael Mann theme, right? It's the expertise of forensic. And Mann loves taking you through procedural rationalism, which is why it's weird there's none of that in Ferrari. You would think it would be exactly a Michael Mann thing anyway. So how does Graham triumph in the end, right? Yeah. He triumphs through bureaucracy or institutions or being on the right side of the law. Mm-hmm. And it's my role to catch, not to kill. Yeah. You're insane. I'm clearly not insane, however much it's damaging to me to be in your presence. And again, Man would often say about Heat, you want both Al Pacino's character and Robert De Niro's character to win. Yeah. But in the end, it is the policeman who wins. So, for this again, I think might be why Thief is so interesting, because in the end, the person on the wrong side of the law kind of just wins or walks away sort of on his own terms or in triumph. Whereas in the other Michael Mann criminal movies, in the end, the law does win, the state does win, does it not? Yeah.
Well, I think the theme of doubling And the doubling of our hero and villain is a definite continuous theme in the Michael Mann movies. You know, the easy way to reconcile this with what happens in Thief is that there are no heroic law enforcement figures in Thief. Right. Our anti-hero and our villain are both criminals. And the anti-hero wins, you know, in that case, which is consistent, broadly speaking, with what happens in the later movies. It's just that the presence of formalized law enforcement is not to be found in Thief in the same way that it is found in Manhunter or Heat, for example. So, but I do think that kind of doubling of our characters, right, the twinning of the hero and villain is on full display in Manhunter, and it's a consistent theme at least in the action movies that Michael Mann is telling. Although the twinning of the main characters is also on display in The Insider. It's just that they're basically the same character, right? It's not a kind of a dark twin theme, which is what I think Mann tends to lean into.
Right. Okay. All right. So I think in this matchup, it's pretty clear that we want to advance Manhunter for our grand finale.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a hands down, you know, wiping the floor with Manhunter.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So our next matchup is going to be Ali and Last of the Mohicans. Okay. And then we've got a final matchup after that, which is a bit of a clash of the titans between Heat and Collateral. So that's what's to come. What did you make of our thoughts on this video? What did you make of our thoughts on these two movies, Manhunter and Ferrari? Why am I forgetting the title of the movie we just discussed? Maybe that's its own message.
That's the point.
Did we get these movies right? Did we get them wrong? Would you have advanced a different movie? So please do leave a comment. We'd love to engage with your thoughts. But on that bombshell,